Thank you. The title of the presentation is Musical Heterotopia, New Perspective on Music in the Concentration Camp on Auschwitz Example. I prepared PowerPoint presentation, but unfortunately due to some complications, technical complications, it won't work. So here we go. Finding the right idiom to describe Holocaust experience in various aspects of life within Holocaust is one of the driving forces in Holocaust scholarship. The emphasis is put on different dominants depending on the adopted perspective. Various interpretations, banalization or normalization of Holocaust, underlining the terror of death camps are reflected in interpretations of cultural life suggested by some authors, who are also suggesting at the same time that inmates led cultural life with new patterns of behavior as a consequence of new strategies of survival. Harsh environment in which musical life was experienced is also stressed by some authors, claiming that only by taking them into consideration the music experience in death camps can be understood. As I said, the existence of death camps with well-documented cultural life as well as music performed in these music has already been the topic of scholarly research. Most authors concentrated on documenting the facts, the repertoire, confirming the names of musicians, or focused on the functions of music played there. The awkwardness and unsuitability of the music present in death camps have also been stressed. In this presentation, I would like to propose a new perspective of interpreting music in death camps, taking as an example Auschwitz. Michael Foucault, in his 1967 text, suggested the existence of places, real places, serving the purpose of counter sites. These places, he proposed to call heterotopias, are directly related to the society, but working as distorted mirror reflections of utopias. Utopias are placeless places, whereas heterotopias are the oppositions, outside of all places, even though it may be possible to indicate their location on the map. As Foucault claims, the duality of representation of places is deeply written into European history. For example, in Middle Ages, the division included the split between sacred and profane, open, protected, urban and rural, and in cosmological aspects, celestial and super-celestial. These were spaces of emplacement. Yet, as I quote, the fatal intersection of time with space affected the concept of space, producing new ideas, the one of utopia and heterotopia. In the new understanding, the space is, and I quote Foucault, a set of relations that delineate sites which are irreducible to one another and absolutely not superimposable on one another, end of the quote. Hence, the location in reality, for example, of Polish Oświęcim, does not equal the space created there, no, under the name Auschwitz. Death camps can serve as examples of musical heterotopias in European culture, fulfilling 6 requirements described by Foucault in reference to such places. Principle 1. Michael Foucault writes about heterotopias as places created in any circumstances, asserting that all cultures constitute their own heterotopias. Heterotopias are then epoch-bound, tailored according to the time and connected with particular historical moment. As Foucault assured, no universal form of heterotopias exists, as they can take different shapes depending on the surrounding circumstances. The musical life taking place in death camps represent the concept of musical heterotopia being the particular exemplification of organizing musical life according to the 19th century patterns. In fact, the same or similar tendencies can be observed in Auschwitz. Not only the organization of musical life in camps was modeled upon the one present in most European cities, but it also reflected the 19th century alleviation of the status of musician within society. Romantic alleviation of music was especially cherished in Auschwitz, and consequently musicians in camps, although not initially, were among prominent, sometimes more privileged inmates. As the distinctive musical life that grew in Auschwitz bore all the signs of this harsh environment, its superficial resemblance to the normality needs to be underlined, since, following the tradition, such forms of musical life as performance, education, and composing developed in the camps. So performing music. Not only on the organization level camps were modeled upon European patterns, it also, in a heterotopian way, maintained the split into public and private. Public meant there the official activities, performed with the approval from the authorities, while domestic music making took form of unofficial singing or playing instruments in blocks. Most authors see this division as official versus secret. However, evidence suggests that a lot of music making taking place in blocks was actually done with silent agreement of block leaders, especially as the nature of such events, the sheer loudness, would prevent them from being really kept in secret. Furthermore, such big and difficult to hide instruments like xylophone were used. Orchestras became the constant element of camp lives, and they existed in almost all camps. Furthermore, orchestras in Auschwitz were assigned their own locations, within which, within this so-called Musikstuben, lockers for instruments were placed, as well as the ones for the scores. There were also additional tables used for the musicians copying their parts. The workshop where instruments were repaired was organized, and musical rooms were even decorated accordingly with portraits of famous composers, Bach, Beethoven, Haydn, etc. Similarly, the situation looked in Birkenau, where musicians were also given barrack number 17. Also, similarly, the situation looked for Frau Orchestra, and as well in Monowitz, where barrack number 11 served musical purposes initially. Their normality of musical life was emulated during concerts. The Auschwitz I orchestra, led by Franciszek Nierychło, played for SS officers. The performances of special status were the ones near Rudolf's villa, as members of the orchestra were dressed up in linen or cotton suits with a red stripe on their backs, wearing trousers with a stripe going on a side, and a cap hemmed with black fabrics. Similarly, Frau Orchestra in Birkenau for concerts was wearing white blouses, dark blue skirts, and blue scarf on their heads. And some of the inmates who didn't play in orchestra even called them dressed-up dolls in their memoirs. Only in Monowitz, orchestra members cherished less privileges. They wore the same clothes as the others. Sundays were celebrated as musical days, as well as formal visits were occasions for orchestra to play the repertoire. Alongside orchestra, also choirs existed. In Camp Rajsko, women created in 1933 a singing ensemble called Peony, as they would pinpoint that flower to their uniforms while performing. The choir gave concerts after supper, often with Kapot Zimmer taking part in them. The second activity emulating normality, composing. Despite the problems with proper staff paper, pencils, composing was also an element of musical life in camps. The composed forms were deeply rooted in the 19th century tradition. The anthem in Lager Auschwitz performed the function of a camp hymn. However, mostly songs were composed in Auschwitz, mainly for the internal use among the inmates. Whereas for the orchestras, marches were needed. Hence, the leaders, like already mentioned Franz Nierychło, composed some simple marches. And finally, education is also an important part of musical life. In Auschwitz, it took usually secret forms. Nevertheless, the important division can be noted into educating children and adults. The informal character of learning was characteristic for adult education. Women learned songs one from another, often memorizing lyrics by heart. Apart from organizing aspect of musical life, I'm going to skip. Principle 2. According to Foucault, the concept of heterotopia encompasses abnormal situations or strange behaviors. Associating music and terror, as well as music and torture, seems to fall into the realm of a second principle characteristic for heterotopia and defined as deviation. Orchestra played a valuable role in the extermination process, and music was used as a tool of torture, becoming thus a part of a macabre ritual invented by SS. According to many inmates, music was supposed to accompany the moments of punishment, and it was also heard during the selections as well as executions. Orchestras played also during the retrieval of escapees whose fate was already sealed. In Birkenau, according to Zofia Zykowiak, orchestra was supposed to accompany the process of selecting Jewish to gas chambers. Of course, the accompaniment was supposed to be loud enough to cover other sounds. It is often noted that spontaneous singing often occurred when people were taken to execution sites or awaited their fates. The most preferred songs then were either religious or patriotic ones. Singing was used as a tool of torturing. The idea that only German was the official language of the camps, according to the rule "Hier wird nur Deutsch gesprochen," entangled capos to make inmates sing German songs. They were listening attentively whether the inmates were really singing or just pretending. Prisoners were made to memorize songs overnight, and for those who did not possess the command of the language, it posed a considerable problem. The idea of singing on command is, by some authors, linked with introducing into concentration camps military tradition, where singing together helps to keep the discipline and enables exercising parade marches. On a symbolical level, the organization of life in camps resembled the army, favoring military values and thus enabling SS officers to enact the war reality in an almost theatrical manner. Deviation of a musical life in camps can be observed also in respect to the size and the instruments constituting orchestra. The abnormality of the conditions dictated the inner disposition of these instruments. This distorted, orchestra included then instrument conventionally not used in this type of ensemble. For example, mandolins or accordions in symphonic orchestra. Consequently, they were calling for these dispositions were calling for new arrangements, as well as producing new quality of sound timbre. Some authors call the sound of these orchestras as bizarre, I quote. Principle 3. Juxtaposition is the third principle characterizing heterotopia. Death camps were the arena of events taking place with the real musical life on several different levels, concentrated and focused in one real place. Orchestra, choir, musical theater, even cabaret, various forms of musical life were present in Auschwitz. Juxtaposition characteristic for these situations refers to the incompatibility of the dimensions. Marching tunes used to accompany those going to die, merry songs performed by hungry workers, German lyrics sung by unable to speak the language, etc. Indeed, orchestra playing at the gates was treated by inmates like, and I quote from memoirs, either devil's sarcasm or sometimes called sheer irony. Official musical life entertained in the camp was used as a form of sustaining prestige. It was also used as a tool of stratifying inmates. The alleviated position of musicians, as I said, reflected the 19th century position as talented individuals. Orchestras in Auschwitz were supposed to provide musical entertainment for SS staff as well as their families. Also, capos were interested in having the musical entertainment provided to them requiring specific tunes. This way, musical compositions became objects of demand, and music as such was used as a commodity, similarly to the bourgeois tradition when it was believed to be, and I quote from Tia Denora, a primary medium for acquiring and demonstrating prestige. End of quote. Especially private music concerts were reserved only for those prominent privileged SS officers. Thus, music served as a tool of asserting prestige and importance, exactly like in the 19th century bourgeois society. Domestic musical life, led in camps, was not only private but also reserved, like in the 19th century, only to those entitled. As inmates write in the memoirs, these musical meetings were confined to small groups of music lovers and usually kept secret. Especially it was the case when forbidden repertoire was forbidden. Consequently, such concerts were, as I said, held in conspiracy. And domestic music making, on the contrary to the public or open, featured more solo performances. As I already mentioned a few times, musicians cherished comparatively better conditions. Karl Fritsch, wanting to have the orchestra at his disposal at any time, decided that musicians should be assigned to commandos working inside the lager. Some musicians were in commandos working overnight. Initially, being a member of an orchestra did not mean any additional favor. With time, the situation changed and meant additional portions of food, better clothing, better accommodation. The better position of musicians was especially visible in case of women orchestra in Birkenau under Alma Rose's leadership. Since the position of musician was alleviated, were often, in the eyes of other inmates, considered as people seeking improvement of the conditions, resigning to the protection in order to have lighter work and to live considerably easier. However, other inmates did believe in their sincere intentions, and they said, I quote, being about them as being truly interested in arts without vested motive in these conditions, I do not understand. That's a quotation from Górniak. Principle 4 out of 6 enumerated by Foucault. Heterotopias, according to Foucault, are characterized, and I quote, a break with a traditional time, end of quote. Time passes in heterotopias differently. The rhythm of the day is indicated by the musical frames, from one march to another. The time is orientated inwards and flowing according to camp rules, as if outside the real time. The passing of time is also connected with musical beat. Marching in time was called by Mali Fritz, and I quote, dumb rhythm of fear, end of quote. Notwithstanding the weather conditions, the orchestra was supposed to play regardless the passing seasons, and I must say that in Poland, winters can be pretty cold and summers can be really hot. Nevertheless, the orchestra was always there. There were only a few circumstances in which they could not play outside but inside the assigned barracks. Principle 5. Heterotopias are characterized by the internal system of opening and closing. The admittance and rejection to an orchestra, as well as the choice of repertoire, can serve in case of Auschwitz as exemplification of that principle. Furthermore, the selection and inclusion of instruments into orchestra also include the work of opening Fischer in the heterotopial world of music in the camp. Some inmates believed that orchestras were possibly created as a simple consequence of SS realizing the large number of musicians sent into camps. According to others, however, the initiative to create an orchestra, the first orchestra, originated among inmates themselves. It was apparently the idea of Franciszek Franz Nierychło. Musicians for that first orchestra were recruited during appels. The recruitment for Birkenau Orchestra was even more simple. The people from incoming transports were simply asked if they could play any instruments. The musicians within orchestra were recruited then from various nationalities with different professional careers, professionals as well as amateurs. The system of inclusion was open in terms of people admitted as well as places and forms of recruitment. With time, especially, as I said, when the position of musicians soared, the system of admittance tightened and proved certain frictions among musicians themselves. For example, women orchestra in Birkenau under Zofia Czajkowska lead consisted primarily of Polish musicians, but when Alma Rose was assigned as a conductor, the situation changed, since she preferred Jewish musicians, to such a degree that even the authorities, initially leaving the situation without comments, protested that they did not want to have a quote Semitic orchestra. It was, however, believed that Rose admitted more Jewish players, either because she believed Jewish musicians were genuinely better than others, or in order to create better conditions and to help them to survive. The repertoire, as I mentioned, performed in Auschwitz was also subject of opening principle, depending on the availability of materials and the preference of listeners, as well as dictated by other circumstances. The scores kept in, for example, Auschwitz I in a special closet in Block 24 included the majority of marches, about 100. The second type of compositions performed were German schlagers, pre-war schlagers, such as sentimental ballads or dance tunes. And additionally, there were masterpieces by great composers such as Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Mozart, as well as popular arietas and arias, as well as Strauss's waltzes. The inclusion of instruments into orchestras illustrate the principle of heterotopial openings. Instruments were acquired in various ways. Original letters were sent to families with requests to send instruments. Later, money from inmates' accounts were partially used to buy new instruments. And finally, instruments were confiscated from newcomers. Principle 6, the last. Music in camps was a heterotopial space of illusion of normality and illusion of perfection. The already mentioned theatrical consciousness of actions performed in camps made SS officers perform their tasks in the most perfect way possible. In the absence of the real enemy as at front, the SS men developed the ritual in which they could feel their superiority with and I quote, obsessive German absurd precision, end of quote, applied to musical life. Marching and songs were preferred inside the camp as being after all part and parcel of musical theatrical performances. Most theatrical performances. The strive for perfection of musical life under severe conditions was visible in long hours of rehearsal, ranging from 12 to 17, according to Fania Fenelon, hours per day. Life of musicians was regulated by performances and rehearsals. In the morning, orchestras played around 2 up to 3 hours, accompanying commandos going to work. Furthermore, illusion of perfection was achieved by recruiting the best instrumentalists of Europe. The Kapellmeisters were recruited among Warsaw Opera conductors, etc. But even the very good musicians were tested before being accepted into the orchestra. Perhaps the most famous and recognized instrumentalist that was admitted to Auschwitz Orchestra was a violinist, Alma Rose, Gustav Mahler's niece and the daughter of Arnold Rose. So finally, to conclude, the interpretations of musical life in death camps vary depending on the adopted perspectives, ranging from individual, seeing orchestral concerts as necessary moments of forgetting about the camp reality, to complex analysis of collective cultural life led in camps, integrating musical aspect as its part. Indeed, the musical life in death or concentration camps, as attested by Auschwitz and, for example, Theresienstadt, example with such composers as Klein, Ullmann, or Krassa working there, are to be understood in multidimensionally, perhaps as an emanation of heterotopia in which music plays, if not pivotal, then one of the indispensable roles. Thank you.